The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Tony Mecia with the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. Today's podcast is a recording of a webinar we produced on January 14th, 2026, in partnership with Caregiving Corner on the topic, How to Recognize and Respond to Changes in Aging Adults. In it, I talked with Jennifer Szakaly of Caregiving Corner about how to recognize meaningful changes in aging adults, from things like shifts in behavior to changes in daily routines, and how to respond with compassion and effectiveness. We discussed practical guidance for families navigating caregiving decisions, how to have difficult conversations, and available support resources. We also answered questions from viewers. Many thanks to Caregiving Corner for sponsoring this important conversation on a delicate and vital topic. Now on to the discussion. I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Recognize and Respond to Changes in Aging Adults. Now, this is an important topic. It affects a lot of people. I guess everyone's an aging adult pretty much, but whether you're in that stage of life where you're looking to make some changes, or whether you're a son or a daughter of someone who's an aging adult, or a member of the family or a friend, it really affects so many people, and this is a really important conversation to have today. And today's webinar is a collaboration between the Charlotte Ledger and Caregiving Corner. The Charlotte Ledger is a local media company that provides smart and relevant information to the Charlotte region, including on topics that are important to families and seniors. And we love having conversations like this on webinars and on our podcasts because this kind of format really allows us to go in depth on important issues that, frankly, deserve more time than a quick soundbite or a couple of bullet points. And Caregiving Corner, our partner on the webinar today, has been providing support and guidance to older adults and their families since 2005. And it serves the Charlotte area. Jennifer Szakaly, who's Caregiving Corner's founder and CEO, is here today with me. Jennifer is Caregiving, like I say, the founder and CEO of Caregiving Corner. It's a 21-person firm that provides care management and caregiver counseling services in the greater Charlotte area. She serves on the national board of the Aging Life Care Association, and is a fellow of its Leadership Academy, which is a distinction held by fewer than 50 care managers nationwide. And as a national master guardian and certified care manager, Jennifer is dedicated to setting the standard for excellence in advocacy for older adults. She also hosts the Caregiving Corner podcast, which offers education and insight on all aspects of caregiving. So I know this can be a complicated and sometimes emotional topic. And Jennifer, thanks for joining me today and for having this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So today we're going to talk about how to recognize and respond to changes in aging adults. And here's how it's going to work. Jennifer and I are going to talk for a little while. We're going to have a really good conversation. And then we definitely want to take your questions. And maybe you have some examples of something going on in your life or something you're anticipating having to address in the coming months or years. Feel free to put those questions in the Q&A, type them out, and we will get those asked toward the end of the discussion. So, Jennifer, wanted to ask you, we were talking a little bit earlier, you were talking about how there's some seasonality to this issue. And a lot of people now, and as we're talking here in January, are coming back to work, coming back to school after the holidays. What are you hearing from people that you talk with about, the holidays and sort of what they're seeing about taking care of aging seniors?
Yeah, you're right about that. There is definitely some seasonality to this. We've all just come back from the holidays, from visits with family, most likely. And one of the things that we see is that people, when they're spending time with family, they start to notice things that maybe didn't catch their attention previously. The holidays, particularly the ones at the end of the year, tend to be longer visits with family. And so a lot of family members come back into town after the holidays, and they realize that they need to do something to address some of the concerns that they have. So we see a lot of calls, just to address the concerns that people have, to deal with planning. A lot of people take advantage of kind of the momentum of New Year's resolutions. They make a commitment that, this is going to be something I tackle or I figure out. And then they, connect with us for some help and guidance along the way. So it's definitely something that people, it kind of grabs their attention during the holidays. And so we do see a lot more family concern after the first of the year.
And what sort of things drive that concern? What kind of questions do you typically get?
Yeah, so a lot of them have to do with, experiencing the person in their environment during the holidays. So if you're at the home of an aging loved one, whether that's a parent or grandparent or another family member, noticing things that might be different than a prior visit. So a lot of the changes that people have been telling us about are, changes in energy levels or engagement levels. The way that the person kind of shows up in social settings maybe has changed. Another really common one is hygiene changes, personal hygiene changes. And then the other one is less about the person and really more about their environment, and it's how the person's house kind of shows up. And I'm always a little sensitive to this because the idea of somebody judging somebody else's house when they're there for a visit, we want to be approaching that with grace. But at the same time, there can be some helpful clues that somebody that is an older adult is having difficulty with what we call executive functioning tasks. What I would explain to my kids is kind of the adulting that we all do, paying bills, being able to manage everything about a house. So we've had some families that have come back and said, yeah, I sat down with my mom to kind of go through the bills, and she just had way more set aside. She hadn't gone through any of her mail, or maybe she hadn't done the kind of the preliminary, going through the bills to kind of sort things out. And so people recognizing that some of those struggles have changed, are really key. So when people have gone back for visits, they're noticing changes in the person and changes in the environment. I mentioned hygiene. A way that might show up is that the person maybe doesn't take a shower every day. I had somebody say to me, well, I don't shower every day anyways. And so what we're really looking for is a departure from the norm. And so if somebody has been meticulous about showering every day, doing their hair every day, maybe full makeup, and you notice that it's a little bit different now, that maybe they're skipping some of that or they're repeating outfits. And so maybe that's a sign that the laundry's not being done, or maybe they're not remembering that they wore something, the day prior. So those are the kinds of things. It's not really a judgment about the decisions that the person is making. It's more about what is normal for this person and how have we moved into something that's not as normal. So the example of, the energy, how they show up in social, situations. If you are used to having an older adult in the family that's typically the life of the party, or they're always, sharing lots of stories, and maybe they seem to be a little bit kind of on the sidelines this year and not as engaging, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is something wrong, but that might have gotten your attention, and it might be worth looking into. Again, if that's really different for them, then we might want to take a closer look at that. We can go down the rabbit holes of all the different things that could mean, but those are kind of the three big areas where we've had family give us feedback, particularly after this most recent holiday season, where they've noticed some big changes.
Do older adults typically know that these changes are happening, or do they not see them? When they're pointed out to them, do they acknowledge them or do they not?
So there's a little bit of both. Some people, there's really good evidence now that when somebody is experiencing more mild cognitive impairment, or what we would, refer to as kind of the earlier stages of dementia, there's a lot of masking techniques. So the person they feel they feel like something is off, but they're trying to mask it. So they're trying to compensate in other ways. And so, for example, the person that's maybe really social and engaging, maybe they still show up that way, but they've forgotten that they've already told you some of the same stories. And so the way that presents itself is that now they're looping, they're sharing the same 3 or 4 stories over and over again instead of new information. So there's definitely really good evidence that an older adult can certainly feel, and a lot of people feel comfortable sharing this with families, saying, I don't feel quite right. I've kind of feel kind of foggy. I've got brain fog. I'm not, able to remember things quite as quickly. Those sorts of changes can definitely be apparent to the person themselves. There are some people though that are really in denial about some of the changes. They don't recognize them. And it could be a question of maybe they don't remember that something has changed, or maybe it's just that it's really not registering with them that something is different. And so sometimes in those cases, you do kind of have to gently approach the situation and let the person know that something, has jumped out at you as a change for them.
And how do you know whether something is troublesome, whether it should require more investigation and more probing versus sort of just natural aging? You mentioned, being forgetful. I think we all, as we get older, become more forgetful, but it's not necessarily a problem. It's just part of the natural course of getting older. How do you know that difference? How do you know that dividing line between what is just kind of normal and acceptable versus something where you say, hey, wait, we need to take a closer look at this?
Right. Well, and that's what's so interesting. The more research that comes out, particularly about dementia, for starters, I'll say the biggest misconception is that a lot of this has to do with memory. Our brains were not designed for remembering things. And there was a woman that actually came out to the Queen's Learning Society a few years ago, and I'm not going to remember her name, but I might afterwards. That wrote a wonderful book, but the point of the book was explaining the science behind how your brain works and why it was not meant to remember things, which is maybe why I can't remember her name. What it does is it makes us realize there's so much more parts of our cognition than just remembering things. And so where we look for differences is, I feel the same way as you, Tony. I hope nobody's evaluating me on the things that I forget, because I forget things. Where we look for differences is the person making decisions that are now representative of poor judgment. Or where the decision making itself represents that they have that there might be something else that's kind of driving the detachment from their normal personality. So an example of that would be, if we have a woman who is older, who is very accustomed to, keeping a full face of makeup and jewelry and, really dressed to the nines, then, and maybe we see a little bit of a departure to that she's, wearing maybe more comfortable clothes, or maybe she's foregoing the full face of makeup like she used to have. There could be people that panic and say, gosh, I've never known my mom to do this. This is really different for her. On the other hand, we have to look at it in the grand scheme of things. Is it impacting her in a negative way, the person themselves, that they've moved to a different phase where this is not something that's important to them? So that, any example of makeup or wearing really nice clothes all the time, that may not be, it might represent a big departure for them, but that might not be something that's, that's truly alarming, where we have to kind of have a 5-alarm fire response to the situation. A lot of this is just about just starting to recognize the things that you're noticing that are different, and being patient and watching to see kind of what unfolds and how things start to change with the person.
So if you find yourself in that situation, is the next step a medical evaluation, or what would you actually do?
I think if it's an example where the person is demonstrating poor judgment, so I'll give an example of that. You might have somebody that, there don't appear to be any difficulties, but then all of a sudden you find out that maybe they left their house at 10 o'clock at night to go do their grocery shopping, because that was and that's not something that they've normally done. Now, in and of itself, is that a problem? No, there's grocery stores that are open at 10 p.m., but maybe that does represent for them, like if it's really cold and they've gone out without a coat, and they never drive at night, and now they're making that drive at night, and they seem to not recognize that that's kind of a big deal. That's a change in judgment for them. And so that type of decision would register a little bit more strongly as something that might, require a look. What we always tell people is that, if you're waiting until you start to notice changes, if you go to a neurologist to have them look at brain health, which is, a lot of people feel like if I go to a neurologist, they're going to give me a bad diagnosis and then it's going to be downhill from there. But going to a neurologist is really about maintaining brain health. And if you wait until there's a problem before you go, then the baseline information is skewed a little bit because it actually represents kind of some of the difficulty that you're having now. So, one of the things we do is we encourage people to go start working with a neurologist before you start to have these issues, knowing that as an aging adult, you have an aging brain, and that you are going to have to do things differently to be able to maintain a healthy brain later in life. And if you go into it with that attitude, getting to a doctor sooner is going to be very helpful. And then they would be able to track and measure things much more effectively as family and friends start to notice different changes with you.
I do want to remind people, if you have any questions, go ahead, put them in the Q&A. We will definitely get those asked. You mentioned the seasonality and people coming back from the holidays and noticing things, but we're in a point now, a lot of times when you have older adults, they're living on their own. Maybe you don't see them as much as you do around the holidays. For the other 11 months of the year, what are some ways, if you are spread out and you don't see your loved one as often as you do around the holidays, what are some ways that you can sort of check in or
Right.
obviously spending time, but I mean, do you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah, it's hard. And if you think about it, this is still a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, if you think back just to the 1950s, the makeup of family and the layout, the distribution of family members in the 1940s and 50s was so different in our country. We lived right around the corner in the same town, sometimes on the same street as immediate family members. And so you didn't have this disconnect that we now, we're just two generations removed from that experience of family. And now we are very spread out in different parts of the country, in different countries sometimes, and then the general makeup of family itself is shifting. And so you do have a lot more people that are trying to figure out how to tackle this. And, the sandwich generation, which is the term that we kind of use to describe, if you picture a burger, you're the burger, and the caring for aging parents, is the top part of that sandwich. And then the bottom part is possibly still raising kids. And so if you think about that sandwich, you're kind of getting pressure from both sides. And getting pulled in lots of different directions. And so, adult children that are realizing that they have aging parents in different parts of the country that are far away from them, most likely still have children that they're raising. And more likely than not, they're a double income household where, they and their spouse, if they have one, are not in a position to just drop everything and always be able to hop on a flight and go visit mom or get in the car and drive 5 hours to see dad if something goes wrong. So the long distance caregiving is a pretty new phenomenon, only a few decades old. But we're really finding that there need to be a lot of supports in place. And I will say that is one of the reasons that we get calls, is that care managers can kind of be an extension of the family. And so for long distance caregivers that don't want to be feeling like they've got to hop on a plane, every few weekends when something goes wrong, they can engage the services of an aging life care professional for that person to kind of keep an eye on things and let them know when they do need to make a visit and when they need to come into town. And that's helpful. But they're definitely, long distance caregiving is where we really see a lot of unmet needs in the industry, because there are so many families that are experiencing, distance between members, and that presents a lot of challenges.
Yeah. When you visit your parents or your aging elderly adult family member, are you constantly in evaluation mode? Are there things that you can do that maybe they won't notice, where you can see, like, if there's a problem? If you're over there for dinner for a couple hours, it might not be evident. Are there any tips that you would have for making sure that everything's all right?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, there are some really good tips. I mean, I think it's easy to envision kind of a Sherlock Holmes scenario where you go in and play detective, and you
Right.
you
Like, is there
definitely
that
want.
food in the pantry and in the refrigerator and that
Yeah,
kind of thing,
yeah,
right?
checking food. That's a check that we always do when we're going to see clients. We want to see what's in the pantry and what's in the fridge. You want to make sure that there are that there's fresh food, that there's not things that are spoiled. In everything that you're looking at, you want to figure out how you can be reducing risk of there being some incident that jeopardizes that person's ability to continue to be independent. So risk for falls is huge. So, a lot of folks are very attached to their area rugs. And so, if you notice in someone's house that there's a lip of carpet or that there's a rug that people keep getting their foot caught on or something, helping them. Maybe they haven't moved the rug because it's huge and they can't do that on their own. So, noticing and bringing up some of those things can be very helpful. But doing the food checks, making sure that the person's got medication. A lot of family members are actively involved if they're local in making sure that the medication boxes are organized each week or that sort of thing. Making sure that that it looks like the person is taking their meds, has the ability to continue to provide themselves with good nutrition. They're staying hydrated. This time of year too, we also think about things like making sure that their heat is working. We have a lot of people that we walk in and we realize that we're walking into a rather cold home. And so in talking to the person, we might discover that they just haven't gotten around to calling somebody to come take a look at their heat, or that they don't want to pay the bill to get the heat fixed, or maybe it's not running optimally. And so paying attention to just kind of the environmental things that you experience as a family member or a friend going into someone's house is really critical. But I think also don't be afraid to talk to them about it, and that's sometimes the harder piece of it is having the conversation about some of the things that you're noticing.
We'll definitely get into that in a little bit. I want to
Yeah.
acknowledge some a comment in the chat. Fran says the best example of forgetfulness I've heard is everyone will forget where they put the car keys once in a while, but if you forget what the car keys are for, you're in trouble.
Yes, yes, yeah, that's a good thing. So, and that's the difference between memory and judgment. Being able to look at an item and not understand anymore what it's used for. So, yeah, that would be definitely a sign that something is off. So,
Okay. Let's talk for a little bit about conversations and how to have these conversations, because these are they can be very difficult conversations, I think, right? But if you have
it can.
someone, who's set in their ways, they've been doing something for a certain amount of time, they've been driving their entire life, they've been taking care of themselves their entire life, and it is becoming apparent to you that they are less able maybe to do some of those things that they've always done. How do you approach having that conversation?
Right, right. Well, I think, in the start, I will say these conversations are always better to have well in advance. If you're talking to, let's use the example of an aging parent. If you're talking to an aging parent about what aging well means to them, you're able to glean from those conversations really what they value. So, for example, in speaking to my mom during COVID, I remember she said repeatedly how fortunate she felt to still live in the neighborhood where we grew up, because her experience of community during COVID was so rich, with being able to just walk out her front door, go on a walk, and see all different people of all different ages and backgrounds, and be able to engage with people and enjoy seeing children and enjoy seeing, adults in the neighborhood that she is friends with. And so, for other people, they might have a very different approach where they want to go to a retirement community. They want to have peers. And so, recognizing that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to what an ideal retirement or aging experience looks like is really key. I think if you're having those conversations, if you're lucky to have those conversations early, I would say just continue to have those conversations. Where I feel like the conversations get really hairy with families is when you've got somebody that comes in and they decide that they've noticed something, and the best way to tackle it is head on, but their approach is a little bit too strong. And so it might be, Mom, I was at your house for Christmas. It was an absolute mess. There was mail everywhere. We have got to, I have got to start doing this for you. You've got to let me do all the bills, and take this over, so that this isn't something, because you might forget something. So we actually do have people that's how they speak to their family member. And so that's how they would think to have the conversation. And for an older adult, there's a lot of things in what I just said that they're gonna come off and create a situation where they're gonna be defensive. If you've just told me I have to stop doing something, you're taking away something from me. You've already anticipated that I'm going to forget how to do something that I haven't forgotten yet how to do. And so, of course, that person is going to react poorly because you've just basically, again, you might come into it thinking, oh, I've got this figured out. I'm the adult child. I know what we're going to do. Mom, we're going to do this. I'm going to start doing bills. You don't have to worry about this. You're not going to forget anything. We're going to take over. You don't have to think about this anymore. Is the wrong approach, because the older adult values their independence. Every adult values their independence. And so for that older adult, you've got to figure out an approach that appreciates the independence and the connectivity that they still want to have to whatever it is that they need support with. So using that same example, if you've gone and visited, you've noticed that there's maybe some concerns that bills aren't getting paid. The best way to begin the conversation is trying to tiptoe your way into the situation. So to say, Mom, I know how stressful it can be when you've had a busy week and you look at your table and you've got a week's worth of mail to go through and you've got to sit down and you've got to do bills and it's kind of the last thing that you want to do. What would you think about if I started doing this with you so that I could better understand the bills that you're paying, how you have things set up, so that if you ever needed help in the future, I would understand exactly kind of what systems and processes you have in place. So that's a me asking for permission from my loved one to come alongside them and to learn from them how their process works and how they do this, and offering support and reminding them that there might be a time that you need me to do more. And I'd love to know now how to best do this task for you so that I can do it the way that you would want me to, should something change in the future. So there's not anything threatening. I'm not going to say that it's 100% successful, but it's not as threatening as the first approach. And it again just opens the door for there to be some conversation. If the person is defensive and says, well, what are you talking about? I pay all my bills. I know that, but I don't know how you do that. Do you use online bill pay? Are you writing checks? Or I'd like to have some familiarity with your system, because I'm your backup. If that older adult is widowed or single, kind of reminding them that, I would be your backup if something happened. And so I'd really love to learn how you've got all of this set up. That is a much less threatening way of doing it. And unless it's a dire emergency, you can kind of apply that technique to most every topic that you need to kind of open the door for discussion.
Yeah, I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We'll get to those in just a few minutes. I think it's difficult, for a lot of people in this situation, because it's kind of a role reversal. When you're talking to a parent, they raised you in most cases, right? And now you're kind of having to flip the script a little bit, and that's that can be difficult and weird for both of them. Are there examples of things that you should say versus things that you should not say? And you gave a few examples of those, but are there anything you should definitely? I mean, it sounds like you're saying don't come in and just start bossing around, essentially.
Right.
Let's make it a conversation, have joint decision, buy-in, that kind of thing. But do you have any tips on what to say, what not to say?
Right. Yeah, I definitely think don't ever approach it where you are saying you can't. You can't do this anymore. You don't remember this anymore. You can't pay the bills on, again, just softening the language a little bit and softening the approach. Because if you're coming at them from a situation, if you can't, that's where we see parents start to kind of puff their chest out a little bit, and that's where you get some of the parent-child dynamic, where that parent is going to push back and say, don't you come in here and tell me what I can't do. You're my daughter, you're my son. And so that's where we see people really get kind of riled up about that. So, recognizing that that there is that dynamic, of course, there are a lot of people, and I will say this, hopefully that anybody that's listening, that feels validated by this. There are so many people that experience strained or estranged relationships from parents for a wide variety of reasons. There can be history of mental illness, substance abuse, other forms of abuse, divorce, or earlier on. I mean, all different complications that lead to a place where when someone is working with an aging parent later in life, they are bringing that baggage with them, just like the aging parent is sitting there with their baggage of that adult child. And so I think recognizing that there isn't going to be, again, a one size fits all thing that you can say. We really want to always come from a place of respect and trying to figure out how we can preserve as much independence and dignity for the older adult. And I think sometimes in different generations of adult children are wired, particularly those of us that are still working, give me a good to-do list. I love knocking out a to-do list. So I might make the mistake of coming into my mom's house and saying like, okay, today we're going to do boop, 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 and go through that to-do list. And that may not land very well because my mom doesn't want to feel like an item on my to-do list, right? And so some of us that are in the workforce come in with our action items and to-do list and our need for like productivity and feeling like we've accomplished whatever the tasks are. And we've got to remember that these are people. And so they don't want to feel like a bullet item on your jotter pad. They want you to approach it very differently. But, it may rise to the place where you need support as an adult child, depending on what the dynamics are. You might need therapy as support as your parent may as well, if there are some really unresolved parent-child dynamics that are going to be really prominent during the caregiving years.
Okay. And on this topic, there's a question from Mary. I know, you mentioned, we talked about the example of the finances and how do you pay your bills? Do you pay by check? Do you pay by online banking? Mary asks, what's your advice for getting access to medical records and meeting a parent's medical team?
Yeah, so I think approaching it from the perspective team is a great word. I like when we can go in and say to a person, you have a whole team of people that care about you, that want what's best for you, and that are trying to give you the best, medical, financial, whatever, the advice is. And so to say to that parent, we would really like to be a part of that team, so that if at any point, you need our help communicating, we want to make sure that when you go to the doctor, that they're understanding what you need and that they're being responsive to your needs. But we can't do that unless we have permission from you to be involved on your care team. And so would you feel comfortable giving us access to be able to follow up with your doctor if they're not responsive, through MyChart or, whatever medical record system is being used. So again, approach it from not that I'm going to go request a copy of every single medical record of yours just for the fun of it, but approach it from a perspective of, I want to be on your team and I want to make sure that all of these doctors are doing the best for you. And if we need answers quickly and you're in the hospital, I want to be able to jump on this portal and be able to message your cardiologist or be able to message your primary care doctor. What do you feel like about giving me permission to do that? And maybe even reminding them that permission can be changed. If you change your mind, if you decide you don't like this, we can change. You can change it back to where we don't have access. And usually that's enough to get the person, they're feeling less defensive about why you want to have contact with their doctor. Nobody likes to be tattled on, right? And at the end of the day, they don't want you to be able to send a message to your doctor saying, Mom doesn't take her pills. So, if you can just kind of work around that, you want to be part of the care team. And as family, we want to be in that circle of trust. And so I think approaching it from that way, it's a lot more palatable for the older adult. That's a great question.
There's some good advice in there. I mean, one of the things that you said is basically have these conversations before your back is up against the wall, and have them sort of continually and on an ongoing basis. But we have a question from Elaine, and she wants to know, how do you start the conversations where you notice changes? Because it seems like that has the potential to be a very difficult conversation that kind of comes off as maybe accusations and defensiveness. But when you notice those changes, what's a compassionate way and an effective way to articulate that?
Sure. I'll give a real common example that we use for all our clients that have mild cognitive impairment. So somebody that's kind of on the earlier side of their experience of memory loss and some other cognitive changes. Very often it's kind of one of these things that's like out of sight, out of mind. And so what begins to happen in people's homes is that they'll leave things out because they know if they put them away, they're going to lose them. They're not going to remember where they put them. And so you might start to see people leave things out on counters, and they're not putting things away in drawers or, wherever the items used to be. And so one of the things we will do is we will come in and we will say to the person, do you think it would be helpful if we started using some labels so that you don't even have to give it another thought? Or if somebody was in your house, visiting, they wouldn't have to, worry about bothering you for where things are. And we have clients and the reason we suggest that, for starters, I'll say, is that, again, because our brains weren't intended to remember things, we're lousy at it. And so a really good coping mechanism for cognitive impairment are reminders or Post-it notes or labels, or, instead, when you look at a kitchen and it's full of cabinets, instead of your brain having to retrieve, where is that special pan that I make that one dish in, what cabinet or drawer is it in, labeling everything so that you don't your brain isn't having to retrieve all of that information. It's able to look at the labeling and see. We have a lot of clients that depend on those, and it makes a world of difference. So when somebody is on the earlier side and you're starting as family to notice those changes, you want to try to arm them with coping strategies so that their brain can actually relax, because their brain trying to remember things is actually using more brain power, and that's going to cause problems in other areas. And so saying to a person, would it help if we labeled things? Like, we could put everything away in this cabinet, but what if we got labels so that you would know exactly what is in all of these boxes or all of these labels, so that you don't have to dig through or pull out all these files every time you're looking for something. So offering a solution, I think, is always the best way to approach the issue that you see. So again, if it's an issue of you're starting to notice some confusion, maybe if you're starting to notice, maybe the issue is meals, that they're not eating as much, then maybe that's an opportunity to say, again, if you're local, maybe it's an opportunity to say, Mom, I keep cooking for our whole family, and we have so many leftovers. We have more leftovers than we can eat. Can I bring you, would you be okay with leftovers if I brought you some stuff twice a week or something? Opening that door. You're not telling your mom you're taking over cooking. You're not telling her that she's not doing a good job of, feeding herself well enough. You're just kind of creating an opportunity for you to be helpful without it being something that is intrusive. And so, getting the person to warm up. And again, the more that you can do that, we have some people that, are families that are trying to kind of tackle the hygiene issue. We've started kind of noticing that, mom isn't showering as often. And maybe that's because mom has a fear of falling. Maybe mom is tentative about getting in the shower by herself because she lives alone, and maybe she knows somebody that recently fell, and it wasn't a good outcome. And so saying to that person, instead of, gosh, mom, you used to shower every day and now you're not showering as often, reframing it and saying, I would imagine you might be a little bit afraid of being in the shower by yourself. If something were to happen, what would you think about before we go out to lunch? Maybe I come a little bit early and I'm here in the house while you're taking a shower, just so that if you need me, I'm here. And so again, the offer is not something where you're taking over the task. It's just you're making yourself available for support. and you're naming what it is that could be the issue that they're struggling with. And I think that that's the challenge as well.
Okay. And if people have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We have a couple that are sort of follow-ups to an earlier question. One that says is on the question of medical records and getting medical information. One says, I've run into issues logging into my mom's MyChart. I'm on her HIPAA, but the password keeps changing and requires my mom to provide a code from her phone for me to change the password, but she isn't able to find it on her phone. Her doctor will only communicate via MyChart, and my parents live out of town. And then the other question, similar question, doctors are typically hesitant to share information. How do we get past this? So any tips or suggestions on how to get that medical information given sort of the tough regulatory challenges there?
Right. Yeah. Obtaining it is a little bit trickier. And, unfortunately, two-factor authentication is great for, for an extra layer of security. But the codes that it generates, boy, if I had a dollar for every time we have a client that has a code challenge, that they don't know what phone it's coming to, if it's being called or texted to them, and then the code disappears. The codes are really a challenge. There is a difference between being on someone's HIPAA form and having access to the chart. And so the first thing that I would do is try to make sure that it can be set up where the office that has given your parent portal access to begin with recognizes that the two-factor authentication is kind of a barrier, and that setting it up so that you've got access, or at least communication only access, is critical. The other thing that I will say, we don't really have much control over a doctor's willingness to share, whether you're on someone's HIPAA form or whether you're the POA. Doctors are all handle that a little bit differently, and different practices are different as well. What I tell people is that if you have something to communicate to the doctor, and we don't know if the doctor is going to communicate with you, if something gets faxed in or taken to the doctor's office, that becomes part of the person's medical record, and the doctor will read it. And so a lot of people don't even, have to deal with faxes anymore, but in healthcare, we still use faxes a lot. And so sometimes it's a matter of us writing the doctor a letter. And sometimes we do this as care managers, where we will write a letter and we will say to the doctor, we are working with your mutual patient. We identify the person and we say, we have a lot of concerns. Here's what we've seen. Maybe we know that they are taking too much of their cardiac meds and they're not understanding the directions for a different medication. That is vital information that we don't want to wait for the doctor's office to figure out how to get approval. I need to report that out. That's my obligation for that person's safety. And so I'm going to do that in a fax or a letter that I drop off at the office, because then that does get attached to that person's chart and it does get read by the doctor. So when all else fails, get a fax to the doctor and that will work. But it is a challenge, and the technology piece is not easy. You would think that with everything being accessible that it would be easier and things would be more streamlined. And this is an example of how things are still a little bit fragmented. And part of it is because in some cases you have an end user that isn't fully comfortable with technology. And so that kind of becomes an obstacle that other family members have to deal with, unfortunately.
So this whole topic strikes me as something that's not really talked about all that much. I mean, it is probably in certain circles, but, compared to books and conversations and online discussions on parenting, when you have children, it seems like there's a lot out there on that. But for issues like this, it seems like the information's a little harder to come by. Can you tell me a little bit about what a care manager is and how you know if you should get one?
Yeah, absolutely. So an aging life care manager is an expert who walks the journey of caregiving with a family and walks the journey of aging with an older adult. Our tagline of our association is that we're experts in aging well. And I really like that, because I think that frames for people that everyone's experience of aging is going to be different based on what it is that they want it to be, and then also factors that are going to create some limitations. But looking at each person's situation as an individual to say, what are your goals to the older adult? What are you hoping to accomplish? Where do you want to receive care? What do you want that experience to look like and feel like for you? If we're leading with their goals in mind, we can help get the family organized on and understanding what the plan is based on that person's benefits, budget, and really our recommendations for what it is that that person needs. So when we come into a situation, we're doing an A to Z, assessment of their situation, their budget, their environment, their care needs, family dynamics, what their community support looks like, all of that. And we're creating a plan for the family to essentially have at their disposal. But then we're working with the client on an ongoing basis to continue to be an advocate and continue to monitor things to make sure that we are still on track for this person to be able to stay at home and age in place. Or maybe something happens and we need to pivot. And so we're the ones that are helping kind of guide the family and understand what the options are and why we have to make a different decision than maybe we had hoped. So I use a lot of analogies that just like people have a wealth advisor, you can do everything as a caregiver yourself, but having a care manager is kind of analogous to having a wealth advisor. It's somebody that knows the industry, that knows the system, that knows how to get the outcomes that you want. And so having us involved provides some neutrality and some independent perspective about what the person really needs. And that's very useful when family dynamics start to flare up, which is often the case. I do want to give a quick website, because recognizing that a lot of people are long distance, the national association that I referenced, it's the Aging Life Care Association. You always want to be working with a care manager that's a member of the Aging Life Care Association. It's aginglifecare.org, aginglifecare.org. And there's an orange button when you click on there that says find an aging life care manager. And you can do a zip code search for anywhere in the country to find an aging life care manager that's near your loved one. We do a lot of work with care managers that are in other parts of the country. If someone's relocating a parent to the Charlotte area, we'll get somebody local to the parent involved, and then we'll help on kind of the receiving end. But I think everybody's situation is different. But if you call and talk to a care manager and find out, we're going to tell you if we can't bring value to the situation yet, or if it's way too early for us to be involved, we might be able to give you some pointers on how to start having conversations. But we're going to let you know, call us back when XYZ happens. So I would encourage people to familiarize themselves with the resources that are available wherever their parents are located.
Got it. And we've talked a little bit about having conversations with parents, both before they reach a critical stage and as maybe they're starting to go through some of these changes. But Heath has a question that I think is kind of interesting. He says, what are your thoughts about how to manage elder care when there are differences between siblings about what should be done? How do we, how do you manage that? I mean, we talk about the parents and children communicating, but what about the children and how do they all communicate? And how do we get them on the same page? And what do you do when there's differences of agreement?
Right. Well, and I might have just answered that in the last little bit. I think one of the critical roles that a care manager plays is that we are an independent and objective perspective. And so when we go into a situation, even though 99% of the time it's a family member that calls us, the older adult is who our client is. And so our obligation is to make sure that their voice is heard in the course of planning and decision making, but that also we are squarely focused on what it is that they need in a situation. And sometimes that does get lost in sibling conflict. And so if siblings are willing to stop and say, hey, we need a third party who doesn't know anything about us to come in and look at this situation and tell us start to finish what this needs to look like, knowing that they're going to have mom or dad's best interest in mind when they do that as evaluation, that is the best way to get really neutral information about what needs to go forward. And then really there wouldn't be any reason that family couldn't get behind that, that should settle any disputes about things, because we are coming in as professionals in this space, who understand, the course of different chronic disease conditions, and understand how things are going to play out and unfold in the coming months and years for that person's care.
Here's another question. Do aging caregivers also handle mental health issues?
Yes, yes. So a lot of the aging life care managers will work with mental health issues. We're seeing a lot of families that are calling us that as part of their aging planning, they're trying to figure out how to help adult children with special needs who have been living with them for their entire lives. And then people are dealing either themselves or with family members that have mental health issues, and so those difficulties can certainly complicate, other diagnoses, and then also the dynamic. You might, if you have a brother who is living with schizophrenia and he currently lives with both of your parents, then anything we do to put a plan in place for the parents is going to impact that brother that lives with your parents. And so, mental health is a big part of conversations that we have, because aging really is happening to the family. It's not an experience that happens in a vacuum just to the older adult.
All right, and here's a question. How affordable are these care manager services?
Yep, that's a great question. So in our market, the range of rates is $150 to $160 an hour. Most of us are set up where we can, be as involved as you want us to be, from the care plan development, all the way to checking in on the person maybe once a month to keep tabs on things, to make sure that things are going smoothly. In other parts of the country, obviously different regions, New York, the care managers in New York are quite a bit more expensive than they are in the Charlotte market. So the rates can go up. Most care managers charge by the hour. So similar to working with an attorney, you would simply be paying for the time that we're involved.
Okay. And it's just the fee paid by the client, right? Or do they typically
That's
get paid
correct.
by, if you place somebody somewhere, is there any fees like that?
That's an important distinction. We do not, as aging life care managers, it's against our code of ethics to accept referral fees. So unlike placement services that are free for clients, we are not allowed to accept any placement fees. So when we make decisions or recommendations, it's free from any financial benefit for us. We work for you, and our job is to tell you what's in your best interest and what a situation, requires.
Okay. Here's another question. I know that falls are a significant risk to the elderly. Curious if you know if most insurance companies cover balance training or physical therapy as part of preventive care. If not, are there any other resources that could be leveraged to help a loved one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and that person is very knowledgeable, because falls and medication errors are the two biggest risk factors for someone living alone, for them to potentially not be able to live alone, due to something happening in one of those kind of two different buckets of things. So the fall risk is huge. Physical therapy can be very helpful. Medicare does cover physical therapy if you meet the home health requirements, which is that you are homebound. So if you're not able to drive to an outpatient setting, they would be able to send a therapist to your home. We do encourage people, though, that still can drive, is to use the benefit. It's not paid at 100%, but Medicare does pay for physical therapy services. There's also opportunities to take classes like Tai Chi, Pilates, yoga, things like that can help with balance and core strengthening, which are really, really fundamental for reducing the risk of falls. I will say that the other fascinating thing that's out there, I'm a bit of a nerd for some of the data that's out there, but there are some great studies that say that the number one thing that we do that can create falls is that we try to do something else while we're talking or while we're walking. So if you've got somebody that's attempting to use, their phone, they're trying to have a conversation, you've called your mom and she's walking around the house, not saying that she's going to fall, but it's creating more of a risk factor. And this has been studied pretty thoroughly if the person is doing anything else while they're trying to walk. So we want to think about minimizing distractions as well.
Okay. Another question. What are your thoughts about balancing personal care and relationship with finance and legal implications, like managing bill payment, controlling bank accounts, enacting POA, power of attorney? What about that?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to balance. It's a lot to juggle. There's a lot of responsibilities, that a caregiver can take on. Just like that person indicated, they might be doing the actual hands-on care. They might be providing supportive services, like taking the person to the doctor's office. They might be doing things like paying the bills, managing all the finances, managing all of the services that come along with having a house. Making sure that the lawn service shows up and is paid and things like that. One of the things that we do when we start working with a family, if we can tell that there's a family caregiver that is really stressed and experiencing kind of what we call caregiver burnout, the first thing that we're going to have them do is kind of download what are all of the things that you're doing. Because if we can find a service, a low cost service that can come in and can take this responsibility off of your plate, then we can free up your energy. The ideal situation is for an adult daughter to be able to be a daughter for her parents, or an adult son to be able to simply be a son for his parents. So we want to try to get as close to that as possible. And so understanding what the caregiver has taken on and how we might be able to match services and support and put that into place so that they're not literally shouldering everything, is a good starting point. I mean, the reality though is that, the research tells us that caregivers more and more are the ones that are shouldering everything and doing everything. And if there aren't financial resources to pay for services, unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of families, is that a family member has to chip in and do things because there aren't any financial resources for any assistance or support for either the caregiver or the older adult. So as we're seeing caregiving impact more and more families, that is the reality that a lot of people are experiencing. And, it's a little scary to think, we've got caregivers that are trying to figure out, should I stay at my job? Do I need to be part-time instead of full-time so that I can take care of these things that are being added to my plate as a caregiver? So it's a lot. There are support groups in the community. So the other thing that we always like to recommend, even if you don't think you're kind of a support group person, that's not really your vibe, going to one of those and at least speaking with the facilitator to figure out what they can offer you in terms of additional support can be really, really helpful for the family caregiver.
Yeah, we have just a few minutes left, and I know there are a few questions out there. We'd like to try to get to them. But you mentioned caregivers and support for caregivers. Do you have, a couple of quick questions. How do you avoid burnout as a caregiver? And then are there resources, other resources in the community that people can turn to?
Right. Yes, that's a great question. So the best thing that you can do to avoid burnout is prioritize self-care. It feels selfish, but if you think about what they tell us on the planes to put your oxygen mask on first, it sounds very cliche, but it makes a lot of sense. If you don't have the oxygen mask on, you're not going to be able to help others. And that's a really good analogy for caregiving. If you're not taking care of yourself and prioritizing your own medical appointments and your own opportunities for a break, or having someone else come in and be the primary, responsible party for that aging parent. If you're not prioritizing that, no one else is going to, and you're going to reach a place of burnout. It's really not a matter of if you get burned out. It's a question of when. So we want to make sure that we're reminding people who are family caregivers to prioritize self-care whenever possible. The biggest hurdle to that is learning to ask or accept help. That's a really hard thing for caregivers to do. The other piece of that is, as far as support, definitely look to your workplace for support. Some HR programs are increasingly offering support for people dealing with elder care. Reaching out to a member of the faith community, or a therapist, a traditional therapist for counseling support, attending a support group, finding people that can share your journey with you. You're going to at some point begin to feel like your friends don't really get it, because if they're not dealing with aging parents in the same way that you are, it just feels different. And so instead of disconnecting from that friendship, try to find people that are on the same journey as you, so that you can have some solidarity and support there as well.
Okay. And one question just about care managers, another one on care managers. Do the care managers evaluate the person, or do they take the information from relatives? Just curious, as different family members can have different viewpoints on the severity of symptoms.
Absolutely. So we basically we take it from everywhere. We want to hear what the family members have noticed. Um, it also kind of gives us a good idea of some of the family dynamics when we start to talk to people about their opinions of the situation. But we are with the older adult getting that information firsthand as well.
Okay. And the last question, I know we could talk about this for hours and hours, and there's so much to dive into. We didn't really get into this too much, but some of the legal documents you might want to have in place. But this question is, can you give some examples of when a healthcare or financial power of attorney should be activated? My mother has recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Right now, she's doing okay, but how do I know when the right time is to move forward?
Yes, that's a good question. The doctors can sometimes give indication. I will say that the doctors are probably going to be the last ones to discover that the person, needs to activate their POA documents. As a POA, when you're acting as agent under either of those documents, you're always doing so with the best interest of the person in mind. And so I would say that if there's been a diagnosis, starting now to have different behaviors and different patterns of accomplishing things. So for example, bill pay, if your loved one with that diagnosis is still doing bill pay because you're in the document as POA, this is an excellent time to say, you know what? I think it would be a great time for me to sit down and learn from you how you normally organize everything with your finances so that I can always be available, if you decide that you don't want to do this or don't, that this isn't something that you want to do down the road. I think starting now, because the diagnosis is in place, to do things will help you step into the role as POA without fully having to take over kind of in an emergent situation. And I'm happy to answer questions. I think y'all can send out my email address if people have. Lots of people will probably leave here and think of lots of questions. And so I'm happy to make my email address available for anybody that's got any follow-up questions.
Okay, so Jennifer Szakaly with Caregiving Corner, and they can probably find a way to reach you on Caregiving Corner's website, I guess, if they have additional questions, right? Yes,
absolutely.
Is there anything we didn't cover today that you wanted to mention?
So much, but it's right. We could talk for hours. I think the biggest takeaway for today is, if you see something, say something. Start the conversation gently and start making some progress.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, that's it for today. Many thanks to Caregiving Corner for sponsoring this important conversation. To find out more about the Charlotte Ledger, go to thecharlotteledger.com. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast was produced by Lindsay Banks.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.